Hello guys, and welcome to a little two-part mini-series that is going to be classic old school TFD. Although we love doing commentary and video essays and economic and political dissections, and all of those are very important, we also do like to, from time to time, get really into sort of the nitty-gritty of personal finance. So although it is not a perfect unit of measurement, we have decided to do this little two-part series dividing two very clear groups of people who need personal finance education and who are our viewers, people who earn more or less than $100,000 a year. But before we dive into this video, I want to give a quick thank you to its sponsor, Monarch. For those of you who don't know, I use Monarch for my everyday budgeting app and have been a huge fan of just budgeting apps in general since I was very first starting on my financial journey. Historically, I used Mint for many, many years. RIP Mint, it was in the first TFD book. It's in many of our old videos. They used to be a sponsor of ours, but Mint is no more. So I have since started using Monarch and honestly love it. It's really easy to use, really intuitive. It has a lot of great features. It makes things like bill pay or splitting finances or debt repayment and all of that like really, really easy, and it's super visual, which is nice for me because I'm a visual person. And if you are earlier on in your money journey, like many people watching this video, I cannot stress enough how important it is to set up good money management practices now, because even if you feel like I don't have that much to budget, having a good way to visualize and understand your money and to not avoid it, which is something I used to do when I was very financially insecure, is insanely important because those habits will carry through and set you up for when you're more financially secure. There's also no ads and they don't sell your financial data to third parties, very important to me. It is just a clean, secure app that makes finances feel simple, and over 1 million people already use it too, including myself. So head to monarchmoney.com/landing/TFD or just use the link in our description and you will get 50% off your first year with code TFD. Now, I want to say a few things up front as we kick this series off, and we are starting it, as you can see, with people who earn less than $100,000 a year. But I want to establish that $100,000 a year of income is, first of all, not the same everywhere. In New York City, that puts you pretty squarely in the middle class, and in places like Manhattan, and especially certain neighborhoods, may not even be enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment. But there are places in the country where earning $100,000 makes you decidedly upper class and is more than enough for your cost of living. And increasingly with things like remote work, you may be able to earn that much money and have total control over where you live and therefore what your cost of living might be. $100,000 per year, as we've also discussed in previous videos, is radically different depending on the financial background you come from. You could be earning $100,000 a year and come from generational wealth and have no student debt as a result and have, an inheritance that's coming up when someone kicks the bucket, and all different kinds of contexts that make it a very different number than someone who earns $100,000 but is heavily in debt, who has to support family members, who has no savings, etc. So nothing that we are going to say is going to be totally perfectly applicable to every single situation. These are just general guidelines that are based on these sort of general states of income. If you are not able to save a ton, even if you are a high earner, or if you're able to save a lot, even not earning that much, like all of this is valid, all of this exists, and there are many factors that play into it. But it is so important to remember that having a lower income does not mean you can't build wealth, does not mean you can't create good habits or create financial stability. And just because you earn a lot of money does not mean you're good with money. You could earn a lot of money and be living paycheck to paycheck, be heavily in debt, have horrendous spending habits, or all of the above. Many such cases, especially in places like New York City. So let's start with the first of our two-part series, what to do with money if you earn less than $100,000 a year. Step 1 is you must get your budget under control. So listen, no matter how much you are bringing in, even if it's very little, you might already be really good at budgeting. In fact, it's often common for lower earners to be better at budgeting than higher earners, because frankly, they often have to be. But when you're working with a lower income and have less to work with, budgeting is absolutely essential. As I've said many times, what gets measured gets managed is one of my all-time favorite expressions. This applies to basically everything in life, but if there is anything you are looking to improve or get control over, the very first step is being very aware of it and learning to manage it actively. And in fact, there are great studies that show that just the act of managing your money actively will help you be better at saving it. Now, if you're already a pro at budgeting, you can skip ahead to the next step, but if you want a little practical advice at budgeting, let's talk about what that means. First, you need to track your spending. Like I said, I still use a budgeting app every single day. I literally just checked it like an hour ago. And even though I'm no longer in things like credit card debt, so therefore don't have to be as like obsessive over looking at money as I used to be, I still like to make sure that anytime I'm spending money, which is basically constantly between bills and cost of living and travel and all of those things, that I really understand where that money's going. Some questions to ask yourself are, what are your common leaks? Food delivery, subscriptions, impulse buys, etc. We have an entire 15-minute budget series on ways to budget for different personality types like avoidance or impulse spenders. I recommend checking that out. It's linked in the description. But also, are you living within your means? Do you regularly outspend what you're bringing in a given month? You do not have to get super obsessive about your spending, although this can be helpful for people like me who are chronic overspenders, but you do have to at least keep your spending in check so that your budget makes room for goals. You then have to actually build a realistic budget. Now, there are a million different ways to build a budget, but we're going to talk just generally about the 50-30-20 rule, because that is the best easy metric, in my opinion, for learning how to balance between needs, wants, and savings. Knowing, of course, that a budget is a living thing and you're going to have to change it and tweak it a few times as time goes on. But the 50-30-20 rule is a personal finance classic for a reason, and it is just a starting point, but I find it helpful. You want to keep 50% of your budget roughly going to needs, which are things like a home, transportation, food, etc. 30% is going to be wants, which is your discretionary spending. It could be everything from travel to clothes to eating out to anything else that you want. And then 20% is going to your goals, your savings, your investment, your debt payoff. You might look at those numbers and say, there's no way, my money is so far away from that. Not a problem. What you need to do now is understand how far away from that you are. If you're currently spending over 50% of your take-home income just on rent, that is a problem, but not an unsolvable one. And the first step is to start measuring and tracking your money accurately so that each percentage point it is reduced by until it's gotten under control, you are aware of it and can keep building on it and understanding what habits are working versus not. Another important thing to achieving a budget like this is finding a system that works for you. Like I said, I use Monarch. Yes, they are sponsoring this video, but I was using them before they sponsored us, to be clear about that. Some people like other apps like YNAB. Some people like using an Excel sheet. Some people use a pencil and paper, although I find that to be a little crazy. Either way, whatever works for you is fine, but find a tool that makes budgeting and looking at your money on a regular basis feel easy and intuitive. The most important thing you can do, lastly, is to link your budget with your long-term thinking. This means visualizing your money and really understanding what the greater purpose is of it, because often when we are lower in income, we feel like we can only ever focus on day-to-day survival and needs, and that thinking about the future or big plans and goals is strictly the territory of people who have more money. This is the wrong way to think about it. The more we start thinking long-term and holistically early on in our financial journey, the easier it will be to make good, aligned, holistic decisions throughout every step of the journey. And again, trust me, there are plenty of people who make plenty of money and live in a very chaotic day-to-day way, even though they could be saving. But that brings me to step 2, which is to confront your numbers. It does not matter how low it is. It does not matter how in the negative it is. You need to know your net worth. And your net worth is literally just your assets minus your liabilities. Your assets are everything you have saved. It's your real estate equity that you've built up if you own a home. It's whatever you have in the bank for retirement, your invested assets, your cash, your emergency fund, that money you have under your bed or in a sock drawer. All of that is your assets. Your liabilities are everything from credit card debt to student loan debt to whatever you have to still pay on your mortgage to basically anything that you owe. Now, if you're in the negative, you probably want to focus more on debt payoff than investment, although there is nuance to that and we'll get into it. But it is so important to know what that number is. Part of the reason money often feels really overwhelming for people is because they choose not to look at the big picture and to keep themselves in the dark about their own finances. Although it can be scary to confront numbers that aren't fun to look at, trust me that it is way worse to not know them. Because not knowing them is not going to make them any better. And in fact, again, studies show very clearly that not knowing is part of what makes them get worse and worse. This is also, by the way, like part of the reason so many years ago we called this the financial diet is because this is also true for health, right? Like people often don't look at health indicators for a very long period of time because they don't want to get bad news. And that is part of what allows them to keep making slow, bad decisions and to delude and lie to themselves about what are the impacts of those decisions until they finally get to a place where they can't ignore it anymore. What is true often for our health is often true for our money. Now, I said that debt versus investment might be prioritized differently depending on your net worth, but let me be clear that it does not matter if your net worth is positive or negative. If you don't have an emergency fund, you must focus on that first. Even while paying off your debt, you need to prioritize at least a small cushion in your emergency fund. We always recommend starting with at least 1 month of expenses before moving toward a debt payoff goal, but in this job market and economy, more cash on hand is better. Your ultimate emergency fund should be at least 3 to 6 months worth of necessary expenses, saved somewhere that it can be put to work while still being accessible, such as a high-yield savings account. We'll link you guys to a few good high-yield savings account below. And once you've saved up at least a month of an emergency fund, if your net worth is in the red or if you have outstanding high-interest debts, decide your payoff strategy next. So you have the avalanche method, which means just focusing on the highest interest debt first. It means you pay the least amount of interest over time, lowering your overall debt burden. Or the debt snowball, which means focusing on the smallest balance first and eliminating it before moving on to the bigger one. A lot of people find this more psychologically motivating since you wipe out debts as you go. You can also look into things like debt consolidation and balance transfer cards, both of which we will link you to below, if you are not sure where to start on your debt and you have a lot of high interest debt to tackle. Lastly, you need to decide when it makes sense to make minimum payments on your debt to prioritize investing versus focusing on paying off debt faster. And regardless, high interest debt like credit card debt should always be prioritized. No investment strategy is likely going to outpace what you are losing to an outstanding balance with things like 20% APR. We have also linked you in the description to a resource to figure out the math on your debt versus investing. But there are other kinds of debt, like for example, my mortgage, where the interest payment is under 3%, where it makes much more sense to pay way less toward that mortgage and put more of that money in the market where it has a much better chance of yielding higher returns over time. This is also true for things like very low interest student loans or any other kind of debt that has a lower interest rate than what you are typically likely to see in returns in the market. Which brings us to step 3, which is mastering the very basics of passive income. Because passive income is not the same thing as easy money. Passive income just means money that you do not have to actively work at a job for. But passive income is extremely important for building wealth and doing things like saving for retirement, even if you don't have a ton of money to work with. We talk about Betterment all the time on here as a really good investing tool. Many of us on staff use it. It is an investment app that you can use to start saving for things like retirement or basically anything else you would want to invest for. And part of the reason we endorse it is because it's so accessible even for smaller amounts of money. A lot of us think that you have to be rich to get into investing. Let me assure you, you do not. You can invest with very small amounts of money. When I first started putting money into a retirement account, I was literally putting sometimes as little as like $20 a month into this account. Now, there are other types of passive income than investing, but investing is by far the most common and the most accessible, so I want to talk about that one. Also, I just want to make a note that never ever think of real estate as passive income. Real estate is an enormous amount of work, both on the active management of it, on the volatility of it, on the scouting of it, on the work of the houses or properties themselves. Real estate is essentially its own profession. Like, you should not look at that as passive income. But anyway, investing, especially very diversified, low maintenance investing, is truly passive income, and it's crucial to start doing when you don't earn much, because the most important factor in investing is not the actual money, but time in the market. Here's one of my favorite numerical examples for illustrating this. Quote, if you invest $2,000 a year, just $166 a month, from age 19 to 27, and you do not save anything again beyond that point, and you assume that your investments yield an average of 10% rate of return over the course of your lifetime, you'll end up with $1 million by the time that you're 65. To be clear, 10% is a high rate of return, so it might be less than that, but the numbers are still quite staggering. On the other hand, if you wait until you're 27 to start saving $2,000 a year and then save for the next 38 years, you'll end up with $800,000 by the age of 65. In other words, you would make $200,000 more by the time you're 65 if you started investing at 19 and would have only had to save for 8 years total versus starting at 27 and saving for 38 years straight. This is not, by the way, to say that if you didn't start investing at 19, it's too late. It is to say that today is the best day to start investing, second only to yesterday, but still way better than tomorrow. And that it isn't about the amount of money you can save, but the amount of time you can leave it in the market. Now, as far as where you'll want to invest, if you have one, you'll want to start with workplace retirement accounts like a 401k or a 403b, especially if they have employer matching, which you should always take advantage of. If you don't enroll, you're leaving free money on the table. And if you don't have access to an employer-sponsored plan, you should always consider a Roth IRA, a SEP IRA, or a solo 401k. Just make sure you actually always invest what is in the account. It doesn't automatically do it. You have to do it. Then you want to decide your asset allocation. This is a mix of stocks, bonds, cash, based on your goals and your risk tolerance. And the younger you are, generally speaking, the more risk you're able to take on, which is often why you will see those higher average returns. That's more money in stocks, less in bonds. And your asset allocation will change over time and is something to revisit every few years. Eventually, if you do start building wealth and increasing your income, you may eventually want to do what I do and work with a financial advisor to help you manage your portfolio over time more actively. But especially as you're young, that is not at all necessary, and being well diversified in something very simple like an index fund is going to be all that you need. So don't put off investing, but at the same time, don't bite off more than you can chew. Never, ever, ever engage in individual stock picking. It will not beat the market and is conflating putting in work with something with getting value out of it, which is the opposite of what passive income is supposed to do. Low, slow, steady, and boring are the names of the game when it comes to investing. The most important thing is just getting started and remembering that you do not need to wait to have a lot of money to start thinking in terms of your long-term goals and lifestyle. We've also linked you to a retirement calculator down below that will help you visualize some of these things and start planning literally no matter where you're starting. But eventually you're going to need to come to step 4, which is increasing your income over time. At the end of the day, there are only 2 levers of wealth building: spending less and earning more. And if you are a lower earner, you are constantly hearing about ways in which you need to spend less. And that is true. If you are someone who has problems with spending, as I did, if you are someone who's trapped in consumer cycles or often spending for more emotional or mental health reasons in an attempt to self-soothe or to increase your self-esteem, which, as we are very clear on this channel, nothing that you can purchase will ever increase your self-esteem. That has to come from within. It is important to get spending under control, no doubt. And that's why step 1 is to always analyze your spending and be judicious about what is and isn't worth your money. But eventually you are going to need to increase that income. When it comes to earning more, you are going to want to start with your day job. That means negotiating raises wherever possible. The most important time to do this is when accepting a job, but it should also be happening on an annual basis. We have linked you in the description to a video entirely about the art of negotiation to get more info on that. You also want to be intentional about things like overtime, promotions, moving outward and upward, because often we will need to move to different employers in order to recognize large promotions or increases in salary. Essentially, thinking intentionally about your job in terms of how you can maximize your income from your main employment, because ultimately that will represent the majority of our income and earning potential. But if you have exhausted your opportunities with your main role, you want to be strategic about your side income. That could be finding seasonal or side jobs, setting deadlines or goals to avoid burnout, taking gigs that meaningfully move you toward your savings goals, because, for example, taking a DoorDash run that costs you as much in gas as you actually made in tips probably isn't going to help, and making sure that you are goal-oriented in your savings so you know what each additional dollar is helping you with. This is one of the reasons why I love a sinking fund, which is basically just a special savings account that you label with something particular you want to save for, because it helps make the value of this additional income much clearer and less abstract. Lastly, you want to adapt the right long-term mindset, because as you increase your income, you don't want your lifestyle to increase along with it. This goes back to our first point, why analyzing your spending on a daily basis, at least at first, is incredibly important to getting your whole money life under control. But lastly, you want to master your milestones. As I said, you cannot wait until you have a certain amount of money to start taking your financial life seriously, and that means taking your future seriously along with it. At the end of the day, we do not know what life is going to bring or how long we're going to be around, but good financial planning, good life planning is about playing the odds, and odds are you will probably still be here a number of years from now, and you will want increasing financial security and stability as you go. You don't want to have to be hustling the same way at 60 that you were at 20. And starting to set up now, even before you necessarily have money to dedicate toward the effort, is about thinking of that future self as much a real and valuable person as thinking of your today self. So here's a little checklist we created to think about those milestones. This is in the form of a little money audit, which we will also link you to. Do you have 3 to 6 months of emergency savings? And always remember to reprioritize this when you have to pull out any money for emergencies, which is, again, what these funds are for. Are you on track with debt payoff? Are you investing toward retirement? Use the calculator that we linked you to in order to ensure you're doing the most you can in your given situation to be planning for that future self. And then you want to consult your life admin tasks. Do you have an annual tax plan in place? Do you have a will or a trust? Yes, this is less important if you are a single 20-something with no dependents, but it does become important as we age, and many people don't do it. Are you keeping up your insurance to date? That could be anything from renter's insurance, home insurance, health, life, etc. Are you rolling over any old 401ks? Anytime we change jobs, if we had any kind of retirement savings, that is something we need to do. Are we comparing high-yield savings accounts / transferring money whenever it's needed? You do not need to have a lot of money in order to take yourself seriously. And I promise you, as someone who started taking their own financial self seriously when I was literally heavily in the red on high interest credit card debt, and had basically nothing to my name and no self-esteem when it came to my own ability to plan for myself, the fact that I started taking myself seriously all the way back then and started thinking of this future self is without a doubt the number one thing that allowed me to be 10 plus years later in a position where I am financially stable, where I do have good habits in place, where I'm not scared about confronting my own finances and planning for my future. I wish you guys all the same, no matter where you're starting. And again, even if you earn way less than $100,000 a year, you can start acting like someone who is worth taking care of. Bye, guys.